That man wiped out her father's $20 million debt. In exchange, he only needed her to take the name Valentini for a year. But upon entering that mansion, Evelyn realized this wasn't simply a marriage contract. If you want to know what this mysterious man really wants from an ordinary pediatrician, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and comment the city you're watching in so I know how far my story has progressed. For now, let's begin with the night everything fell apart. The night Evelyn Harper's world collapsed. She was elbow deep in paperwork and smelled like antiseptic and cold coffee. She'd been on her feet since 6 that morning. 12 hours in Pediatric Ward 3, 2 emergency consults, 1 brutal conversation with a mother who didn't want to hear that her 7-year-old's prognosis had worsened. Evelyn had delivered that news without flinching, the way she always did. Steady voice, direct eye contact, hands folded on the table so they wouldn't shake. Afterward, she'd locked herself in the supply closet for 4 minutes and pressed her back against the metal shelving until she could breathe again. That was the only luxury she allowed herself. She was 34 years old, and she hadn't cried in front of anyone since her mother's funeral. She drove home through Chicago's November freeze with the heater broken and her coat still damp from where a kid had vomited on her sleeve during evening rounds. The apartment she shared with nothing but unpaid bills and a dying houseplant was only 20 minutes from St. Augustine Children's Hospital, her father's hospital, the one he'd spent 40 years building into something real. The drive usually cleared her head. Tonight, it didn't. She'd seen the quarterly numbers that afternoon, accidentally because her father had left the spreadsheet open on his office computer while he stepped out to take a call, and Evelyn had sat down to check her email and found herself staring at figures that made no sense. Debt columns that dwarfed any operational shortfall she'd ever heard him mention, numbers with too many zeros, numbers that looked less like bad management and more like someone had been systematically bleeding the place dry. She'd closed the spreadsheet and not said a word. That was something else she was practiced at, seeing things she wasn't supposed to see and carrying them quietly until the right moment. But she hadn't stopped thinking about it. She pulled onto their street, the house where she'd grown up, where her father still lived alone since her mother died 6 years back, and almost missed the cars parked along the curb. 3 black SUVs, spotless despite the slush. The kind of vehicles that didn't belong in this neighborhood, on this street, in front of that particular porch with its peeling white paint and the loose gutter her father had been meaning to fix for 3 winters running. Evelyn sat in her car for a moment with the engine idling. She was tired. She was cold. She had a shift at 7 in the morning, and her left knee ached from standing all day, and she genuinely could not think of a single innocent explanation for those cars. She went inside anyway. Her father was in the living room, seated in his armchair the way a man sits when he's trying very hard to appear calm and failing. His hands were on his knees and his knuckles were pale. He was 63 years old, and he looked in that moment like something had been taken from him. Not just money or property, but something more essential. Some structural belief he'd been relying on without knowing it. There were 2 men standing near the doorway to the kitchen. Not threatening exactly, just present in the way that certain men are present, occupying space more completely than their physical size should allow, making a room feel smaller just by being in it. And then there was the 3rd man. He was standing by the window looking out at the street, and he didn't turn around immediately when Evelyn came in. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal suit that had clearly been made for him specifically. Dark hair, cut short. He held a glass of her father's whiskey, the good bottle, the one her father only opened on occasions, and he was turning it slowly in his hand without drinking from it. When he finally turned, Evelyn understood why her father's knuckles were white. The man had a face that was handsome the way weather is handsome, structurally impressive, largely indifferent to how it affected you. Dark eyes that moved across the room the way a doctor's eyes move across a patient's chart, cataloging, assessing, filing information away. He wasn't young, mid-40s maybe, the kind of age that sits on certain men like authority rather than decline. She knew who he was. Anyone who'd spent more than 2 years in Chicago and paid any attention to the undercurrents of the city knew who Damien Valenti was, even if they'd never said his name out loud in polite company. "Dr. Harper," he said. His voice was quiet. That was the first thing that surprised her. She'd expected volume, theater, the performative bass register of men who needed to demonstrate their power. Instead, He just sounded like someone who had never needed to raise his voice in his life because things had always gone the way he'd arranged them to go. I was beginning to wonder if you'd be joining us. This is my father's house, Evelyn said. She set her bag down on the entryway table and looked at her father. Dad? Evelyn. His voice cracked on her name, just slightly. Enough. Your father and I have been having a conversation, Damien Valenti said. He set the untouched whiskey glass on the windowsill with a small, precise click. About a debt. What kind of debt? $22 million. He said it the way someone else might say $22. No particular emphasis, no dramatic pause. Just a number. Give or take. The interest has become somewhat complicated to calculate at this point. Evelyn's face didn't change. To whom? To people who are no longer in a position to collect it themselves. Damien clasped his hands behind his back. The debt was transferred to me approximately 8 months ago as part of a larger financial arrangement. I've had no urgency to pursue it until recently. Recent developments have made it relevant again. Dad? She looked at her father again. What is this? Robert Harper finally looked up at his daughter. His eyes were red at the rims, which she recognized as the particular redness of a man who has not been crying, but has been fighting the urge to for an extended period of time. I owe this man a great deal of money, he said. His voice was careful, each word placed down like something fragile. I have owed people a great deal of money for longer than I've told you. How long? 7 years. The number landed in Evelyn's chest like something physical. 7 years. Her mother had been alive 7 years ago. St. Augustine had been expanding, or trying to. Her father had been attending conferences, speaking at fundraisers, shaking hands with donors and city officials, and looking from the outside like a man whose vision was finally becoming real. The hospital, she said. Yes. Robert's jaw tightened. The hospital. Damien Valenti was watching her with an expression that was difficult to read, not cruel, not satisfied, but attentive in a way that suggested he was recalibrating something based on what he was seeing. Your father is not a dishonest man, he said. That's relevant context. I don't need character references from you. The faintest shift at the corners of his mouth. Not a smile. Something more controlled than a smile. No, I don't suppose you do. He moved away from the window, unhurried, and stopped in the center of the room where the lamplight caught the silver at his temples. I'm going to make a proposal. You can refuse it. There will be no threats made in this room tonight. I want to be very clear about that. But the debt exists regardless of what you decide. And if you refuse, I will begin the process of collecting it through legal channels. St. Augustine Children's Hospital will not survive that process. I suspect you already understand that. Evelyn's hands were still at her sides. Her coat was still damp. She was standing in her childhood living room at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night, being told that the thing her father had dedicated his life to was about to be destroyed, and she was holding herself very carefully because the alternative was letting go, and she had never in her adult life permitted herself to let go. What proposal? She said. Damien reached into his jacket and produced an envelope. He set it on the coffee table between them. I need a wife, he said. Legally. For 1 year. Someone who can stand beside me at family functions, sign documents when required, and maintain a convincing enough public presence that certain people who are watching my household closely will be satisfied with what they see. He paused. I'm not asking for anything beyond that. I want to be precise about what I mean by nothing beyond that. I mean nothing. Separate rooms. Separate lives within the same roof. A professional arrangement with a specific end date. The silence in the room was absolute. Evelyn looked at the envelope on the table. She looked at her father, who had closed his eyes. She looked back at Damien Valenti, who was watching her with those cataloging eyes and waiting with the patience of someone who had already run every permutation of this conversation and knew what came next. Why me? She said. Because you're credible, he said simply. You're educated, respected, and you have no criminal record and no history of addiction or public instability. You're not connected to any of the organizations my enemies might attempt to use as leverage. And your father's situation gives me a reasonable expectation that you'll honor the agreement. He tilted his head slightly. Also, frankly, because you walked into this room with three armed men present, and your primary reaction was to verify your father's condition before assessing your own danger. That suggests a particular kind of person. The kind who's useful to you. The kind who keeps their word. Robert Harper made a sound that wasn't quite a word. His daughter glanced at him. The set of his shoulders, the particular quality of his stillness, and understood that he had already spent however many hours this conversation had lasted trying to find another way out, and had not found one. She picked up the envelope. Inside was a single folded page, clean lines, precise language, the kind of contract that had been written by someone with a very good legal education. 1 year from the date of signing, all of the debt, every dollar, every accumulated interest, forgiven in full upon completion. St. Augustine protected. Her father's name cleared. Separate living arrangements explicitly guaranteed. A confidentiality clause. A termination provision in her favor if certain conditions were violated. It was, she thought, the most meticulously drafted document she had ever read from someone who was effectively holding her family hostage. She folded it back and looked up. "I have a condition," she said. Something shifted in Damien Valenti's expression. Minor. Like watching a still body of water register a pebble drop too far away to see. "Go on." "I keep my position at the hospital. My shift schedule doesn't change. Whatever this arrangement looks like publicly, I am still a practicing physician, and my patients take priority over appearances." He considered her for a long moment. "Agreed. And my father is left completely alone. No contact. No surveillance. No reminders that this arrangement exists." "Also agreed." She looked at him steadily. "Why do you actually need this? Not the version you just told me. The real reason." The room was very quiet. One of the men near the kitchen doorway shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. Damien Valenti looked at Evelyn Harper with those unreadable dark eyes and said, "That is the one question I'm going to ask you not to pursue." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He picked up the whiskey glass from the windowsill and finally took a small sip and set it back down. "Sign the contract or don't, Dr. Harper, but make the decision tonight. I have other matters to attend to before morning." Evelyn looked at her father one more time. Robert Harper had opened his eyes and was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him since she was 8 years old and had fallen off her bicycle and broken her arm, and he'd been trying to hold himself together for her sake while she bled onto the sidewalk. That particular flavor of helpless love, the kind that knows it has failed to protect the person it loves most. She turned back to the contract. She picked up the pen from her coat pocket. She always carried one, force of habit from a decade of signing charts. And she found the signature line and she wrote her name. Her handwriting was steady. It was always steady. She set the pen down and slid the contract across the coffee table. 1 year, she said. Then we're done. Damien Valenti looked at the signed page. Then he looked at her. There was something in his expression in that precise moment, something that moved beneath the surface of his composure like a current beneath ice. And then it was gone, replaced by the same controlled neutrality he'd worn since he walked into the room. 1 year, he confirmed. I'll have a car here at 8 tomorrow morning. He nodded once to the men near the doorway. They moved toward the exit with the quiet efficiency of people who had performed this exact motion many times before. Damien followed them, pausing at the door to the entryway. He looked back at Evelyn. You should know, he said quietly, that what I'm asking you to do is not without risk. I told you there would be no threats tonight, and there won't be. But there are people watching my household who will not be satisfied with anything less than a convincing performance. If they become convinced the arrangement is not genuine, the situation will become complicated in ways that go beyond financial matters. Evelyn held his gaze. How complicated? The kind that can't be resolved with paperwork. The door closed behind him. The sound of the SUVs leaving was almost inaudible through the insulated walls. Evelyn stood in her father's living room for a long moment after they were gone, looking at nothing in particular, her signed name fresh on a contract that was probably already in Damien Valenti's inside pocket. The lamp made the room amber and small. The loose gutter outside the window ticked against the siding in the wind. Her father hadn't moved. She crossed the room and sat on the arm of his chair, the way she'd done as a child when the world felt too large, and she put her hand on his shoulder. 7 years, she said. Dad, 7 years. I know. His voice was very quiet, broken at the edges. I kept thinking I could fix it. Every year I thought, this year I'll find a way. And then your mother got sick and I couldn't. He stopped, swallowed hard. I couldn't tell her. And then after, I couldn't tell you. Because telling you meant watching you look at me the way you're looking at me right now. Evelyn was not looking at him with anger. She was looking at him with the particular exhaustion of someone who has loved a person long enough to understand all the ways that love can fail to protect anyone. It's going to be all right, she said. Not because she believed it with certainty, because it was the only sentence that held any weight right now and she needed something to hold on to. Her father put his hand over hers. His skin was dry and papery, older than she ever expected it to be. You don't have to do this. Yes, I do. She straightened up, looked at the window. Get some sleep. I have to pack. She went home to her apartment and stood in the kitchen for a long time staring at the counter. She wasn't panicking. She didn't panic. It wasn't something she did, or something she permitted herself to do. But her mind was running the way it ran when she was in the middle of a complicated case, tracking variables, assessing information, looking for the thing that didn't fit. Why her? Really, why her? The reasons Damien Valenti had given were plausible. They were even intelligent. But there was a precision to his selection that bothered her in the way a test result bothers you when the numbers are technically within normal range, but some instinct says they shouldn't be. He hadn't found her at random. He'd known her name before he'd walked into that room. He'd known enough about her to make a calculated decision that she was the right candidate for whatever this arrangement actually was. That suggested research, deliberate research conducted before tonight, which meant the conversation had never been about whether she would say yes. It had been about watching how she said it. She packed a single bag, practical clothes, her medical kit, the photograph of her mother from her nightstand. She left her dying houseplant where it was and turned off the lights and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for about 10 minutes, not sleeping, just breathing. Tomorrow at 8 a.m., she was going to get into a car and be driven to a house she'd never seen, to live beside a man she didn't know, for reasons he had explicitly refused to explain. She was going to do it because her father's hands had been shaking, and because St. Augustine had 400 pediatric beds and a neonatal ward and 17 doctors who had spent their careers there, and because some prices, when you added everything up, were simply worth paying. She was also, somewhere underneath the calculation and the steadiness and the practiced composure, terrified. She didn't sleep much. The car arrived at 7:58. The Valenti estate was 40 minutes north of the city, set back from a private road behind iron gates and old-growth trees that were bare in November and looked skeletal against the gray morning sky. The house itself, mansion was the more accurate word, though Evelyn resisted the grandiosity of it, was limestone and dark wood, 3 stories, symmetrical in the way that old money builds things, with an implicit confidence that whatever it contained was worth protecting. She got out of the car with her one bag and stood for a moment in the cold, looking up at it. A woman was waiting at the top of the stone steps, late 50s, silver hair pulled back tightly, dressed in dark clothes and wearing an expression that Evelyn couldn't immediately read. Not hostile, not warm, something more careful than either. "Dr. Harper?" the woman said when Evelyn had climbed the steps. "I'm Mrs. Albrecht. I manage the household." "Evelyn is fine." Mrs. Albrecht's expression did something very small and almost imperceptible at that. A flicker, like a word she'd almost said and then decided against. "Of course," she said, and turned to lead her inside. The interior of the house was what Evelyn had expected, and also somehow not what she'd expected. Formal, yes. High ceilings, dark floors, the kind of furnishings that cost more than she made in a year and were arranged with the precision of a stage set. But it was quiet in a way that felt less like emptiness and more like a held breath. The staff they passed in the corridors, and there were several, all moving with the particular efficiency of people who had been doing their jobs for a long time, looked at her with something in their eyes that she couldn't classify on first impression. Not curiosity exactly, not hostility, Something more like recognition. She was being shown to her rooms on the second floor when Mrs. Albrecht paused in the hallway and gestured toward a section of wall between two doorways. The wall was clean and freshly painted, a shade that matched the surrounding walls almost exactly, just slightly off, the way a patch always is. "The house has been recently remodeled in certain areas," Mrs. Albrecht said carefully. Evelyn looked at the wall, then at the similar patch further down the hallway, and the rectangular section above the staircase, where the paint was just slightly newer and the wall hooks had been removed but the slight indentations remained in the plaster where they'd been. Someone had taken down a great many pictures and been very thorough about not replacing them with anything. "I'm sure I'll find my way around," Evelyn said. Mrs. Albrecht opened the door to her room, large, impeccably furnished, entirely impersonal in the way of spaces that have been prepared for occupancy without any specific person in mind, and set a keycard on the dresser. "Mr. Valenti asked that you join him for dinner this evening," she said. 7 o'clock, in the main dining room. She paused at the doorway. "He also wanted me to tell you," and I'm quoting directly, "that the arrangement is as he described it. Nothing has changed from what was agreed last night." "All right," Evelyn said. After Mrs. Albrecht left, Evelyn stood in the center of the room for a long moment. She looked at the carefully made bed, the window that overlooked a dormant garden, the closet door standing open to reveal extra hangers and folded towels, and the meticulous blankness of a space that had been stripped of everything that might tell a story. She turned in a slow circle, taking in the room. On the far wall, near the window, there was one more of those slightly off paint patches, about 60 centimeters wide, 40 high, the right height for something to have been hung there at eye level, where you might look at it first thing in the morning. A photograph, maybe. Or a portrait. Something someone had wanted very badly not to be seen. Evelyn sat down on the edge of the bed and pulled out her phone and looked at the time. She had 6 hours before dinner. She thought about calling her father and decided against it. He needed rest, and she had nothing reassuring to say yet. She thought about the contract she'd signed. 1 year, 365 days. She had made harder commitments and endured worse discomforts than a room in a mansion and a dinner table 7 evenings a week. But she kept looking at that paint patch on the wall, that careful, deliberate blankness where something had once been. It was the same instinct she had with test results that shouldn't be normal, but were. Something in this house didn't fit. And Damien Valenti, who had told her not to ask why, knew exactly what it was. She was already going to find out. She hadn't decided that consciously yet, but she felt it settle into place with the particular quiet certainty of a diagnosis she'd been running toward without realizing. The moment the pieces clicked and the picture became clear, and there was no looking away from it anymore. The thing he was hiding in this house was the reason she was in it. And somewhere in the distance, from behind a door down the hall, she heard the sound of footsteps stop. Then silence. Then very quietly, as if someone had been standing just outside her door, listening to her arrive, the footsteps resumed and moved away. She was not alone in this house. She had understood that already. What she hadn't understood until this moment was the particular quality of the silence that followed those footsteps. It wasn't the silence of a stranger's house. It was the silence of a house waiting to see whether she would recognize it. The footsteps didn't come back. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed for another 10 minutes after the silence settled, listening to the house breathe. Old houses had sounds, the tick of settling wood, the hiss of radiators, the particular quality of silence that gathered in rooms where people had spent a long time feeling things. This house had all of those sounds, layered underneath the surface, quiet like sediment. She'd grown up in a house that had sounds like that. She knew the difference between a house that was empty and a house that was holding something. She unpacked her bag methodically. Clothes in the closet, medical kit in the nightstand drawer, her mother's photograph on the dresser facing the window. She changed out of her travel clothes and washed her face and looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a moment. Not with vanity, just the habitual clinical assessment she applied to everything, including herself. She looked tired. She looked like someone who had not slept and had made an irreversible decision and was carrying both of those things at once. She looked, she thought, like someone who had already started looking for the thing she wasn't supposed to find. She went to dinner at 7. The main dining room was on the ground floor, at the back of the house where tall windows faced the dark garden. The table was long enough to seat 16 people comfortably and set for two at one end, which created its own kind of atmosphere. The formal table, the two place settings, the candles burning in their silver holders, the expanse of empty chairs and unused space stretching away into the dimness. Evelyn stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it in. Damien Valenti was already seated. He was in a different suit than the night before. Charcoal again, she noticed, as if he'd decided years ago that was his color, and stopped negotiating with the question. He was reading something on his phone, which he set face down on the table when she walked in, with the particular deliberateness of a man who understood that undivided attention was a form of power. "Dr. Harper." "You can use my first name," she said, pulling out her chair, "since apparently we're married." "We're not married yet." He poured wine into her glass, red, already opened, something expensive by the smell of it. "That happens Friday." Evelyn sat down. She looked at the food that had already been plated. Roasted vegetables, something with duck, bread that was still warm. Someone in this house cooked with serious intention. "How does that work exactly? The logistics?" "Courthouse. A judge who owes me a favor, which is a phrase I recognize sounds alarming, but in this case means only that he will process the paperwork without unusual delay." He picked up his fork with the same quiet efficiency he seemed to apply to everything. "Two witnesses, a document, 40 minutes of your morning. And after that?" "After that, you live here, and I occasionally need you to appear beside me at a dinner or a family gathering and behave as though this is a normal domestic situation." Evelyn looked at him. "That's a very thin description of what you actually need." He met her gaze. The candlelight made his face harder to read than the lamp in her father's living room had. "What would you prefer I add to it?" "I'd prefer you told me who's watching." A pause. He ate something, set down his fork with precision. "My mother's brother," he said, "Marco Valenti. He has certain interests in the family's assets and certain doubts about my capacity to lead the family appropriately." "What kind of doubts?" "The kind that center on stability, succession. Whether a man who has not demonstrated, in his view, sufficient personal anchoring is the right person to control what the Valenti family controls." He picked up his wine glass. "In his cultural framework, a man without a family of his own is a man without something to lose. A man without something to lose is unpredictable." "So I'm collateral," Evelyn said. "You're a demonstration." He looked at her levelly. "Of stability." She thought about that. Ate a bite of food. It was, in fact, excellent, which seemed like the kind of detail that should be irrelevant, and somehow wasn't. "Your uncle. He's the one I need to convince. Him and the people around him." "How many people?" "Enough that it matters." Evelyn set down her fork. "I need more than that. If I'm going to perform this convincingly, I need to know who's in the room and what they're looking for. I'm a doctor. I don't improvise without information. Give me the actual parameters." Something moved in Damien Valenti's expression. Not surprise exactly. More like the recalibration she'd noticed the night before, the small adjustment of a man who'd run a calculation and found the result was slightly different from his projection. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her across the candlelight and the empty chairs, and the good food going slightly cold between them. "Marco will visit within the next 2 weeks," he said. "He'll bring his wife and 2 of his advisors, men he trusts who've worked with the family for 30 years. They'll be here for 3 days. During those 3 days, you and I will have meals together, appear in the public rooms of the house together, and present as a couple who have been privately married for the past 4 months. He paused. 4 months is the story. We married quietly because I don't do things publicly unless I choose to. 4 months, Evelyn said. So we already know each other. Yes. How did we meet? Through your work. A charity event for the hospital, 6 months ago. She studied him. You've already built this. I've built the outline, he said. You'll need to fill in the details that would be natural for a woman who actually knows me. That requires spending some time in proximity. Learning what's plausible. Learning you, Evelyn said. Certain things about me. He looked out at the dark garden. The things a wife would know. The words sat on the table between them like something neither of them wanted to pick up. All right, she said finally. Then I'll ask questions, and you'll answer them. Within reason. We'll negotiate what that means as we go. She picked up her wine glass. Starting now, you grew up in this house? No, I came to this house when I was 19. Where before that? A pause. New York, then various places. My childhood was not particularly settled. Parents. His jaw tightened, so slightly she almost missed it. Dead, he said, for a long time. Evelyn noted the quality of the silence around that word. Not grief exactly. Grief had a texture she recognized from a decade of delivering bad news. This was something older than grief, something that had been compressed over time into something harder and more structural, the way organic matter becomes stone. Siblings, she said. He looked at her directly. His eyes were very still. No. The word was too even. She filed it. She didn't push. They finished dinner in a conversation that was not quite comfortable but was not hostile, moving through the kinds of facts that could be shared without revealing anything, his preferences in food, which were spare and deliberate, his habits, which were early mornings and late nights with very little in between that wasn't work, his relationship with the house, which was functional and proprietary and not, she sensed, particularly affectionate. He answered her questions the way someone fills out a form, accurately but without elaboration. She did the same when he asked his. They were building, she understood, a shared document, a functional fiction. She went to bed at 10 and lay awake until past midnight, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the paint patches and the empty wall hooks and the word no delivered in a tone too controlled to be honest. The next morning she found the library. It was on the ground floor, past the formal sitting room, behind a door that wasn't locked, but also wasn't prominently indicated. No signage, the door slightly recessed, the kind of architectural afterthought that was actually a deliberate choice in older houses. She found it because she was walking the perimeter of the ground floor methodically, the way she mapped any unfamiliar environment, and she opened every door she came to. The library was large and smelled of old paper and the particular cold that gathers in rooms that aren't heated as consistently as the rest of the house. Floor-to-ceiling shelves on 3 walls, a reading table in the center, 2 leather chairs near a fireplace that had recently been cleaned but not recently used. Books organized with the obsessive precision of someone who cared about them, or had cared about them once, and then stopped. She ran her hand along a shelf and found what she was already, on some level, looking for. Gaps. Books removed and not replaced, leaving spaces like missing teeth. On 3 separate shelves, the gaps were clustered together in a way that suggested not random removal, but purposeful extraction, as if someone had gone through the shelves and pulled everything belonging to a specific category or a specific person. She stood at the 3rd shelf for a long time. You found the library? She turned. Mrs. Albrecht was standing in the doorway. She was carrying a tray. Coffee, Evelyn realized, had already become an automatic morning delivery. The household adapting to her presence with the smooth efficiency of something that had been running a very long time and simply absorbed new variables. The books are interesting, Evelyn said. Mr. Valenti has always been a reader. Some of them are missing. Mrs. Albrecht set the coffee tray on the reading table without changing her expression. Books are lent, misplaced. It happens in any large collection. In clusters, Evelyn said. 3 separate sections, all with gaps. All on the left side of the shelf at eye level. She looked at the housekeeper. Someone pulled everything by a specific author, or on a specific subject, or belonging to a specific person. The silence in the room was very precise. Mrs. Albrecht looked at Evelyn with an expression that had moved beyond careful and into something that Evelyn could only describe, in the clinical language she defaulted to when emotions got complicated, as grief in remission. Present, managed, not gone. You're very observant, Mrs. Albrecht said. I'm a doctor, Evelyn said. It's the job. Mrs. Albrecht picked up the empty portion of the tray and moved toward the door. At the threshold, she paused without turning around. The East Wing is not in use, she said quietly. It hasn't been for several years. Mr. Valenti prefers it remain closed. A beat. I mention this because if you were inclined to take an unsupervised walk through the house, That would be the area I would suggest you avoid." She left. Evelyn poured herself coffee and stood looking at the shelf with the gaps for a long time. She avoided the East Wing for 4 days. It was not entirely a moral decision. It was partly strategic. She was mapping the house's rhythms, learning who moved where and when, understanding the texture of the household before she introduced a variable that would change it. She attended meals with Damien. She answered questions when Mrs. Albrecht relayed them. She ran in the morning along the private road and returned cold and clear-headed and went to work at the hospital 4 days a week because that was the condition she'd negotiated and she held to conditions. Damien, she was learning, ran on a schedule that was almost monastic in its regularity. He was in his office, a room on the second floor that she'd passed but not entered, from 6 in the morning until noon. He ate lunch alone, took calls in the afternoon, handled whatever it was he handled in the evening hours, and appeared at dinner at 7 with the punctuality of a man for whom lateness represented a form of disorder he refused to tolerate. They talked at dinner. It became a thing. Not comfortable, not warm, but functional and occasionally sharp in ways that surprised her. He was more intelligent than she'd given him credit for in that first conversation, which she recognized was her own bias, a reflexive underestimation of a man she'd categorized as dangerous before she'd categorized him as anything else. He was also more contained than she'd expected. Not cold, exactly. More like someone who had learned very deliberately to take up less emotional space than they naturally occupied. She recognized that. She practiced something similar. On the 5th day, Marco Valenti called. She was in the kitchen, which she'd started using in the mornings before the formal breakfast because it was warmer and less architectural than the dining room, and one of the younger kitchen staff, a woman named Petra, 22, who made excellent coffee and had the very useful quality of being naturally talkative, had started leaving the good pastries out when Evelyn appeared. She was reading patient files on her tablet when she heard Damien's voice from the hallway, adjacent to the kitchen, low and controlled with an undertow of something she couldn't name. She was not eavesdropping. She simply did not make noise. 2 weeks, Damien said. His voice was careful, the way her voice was careful. The particular steadiness of someone managing something volatile by keeping the container very still. I told you 2 weeks, Marco. A pause. The other voice was audible only as a register, not as words. She is here, Damien said. She has been here. There is nothing to verify in person that... Another pause. Longer. Fine. The word was flat. Come Thursday. We'll be ready. The sound of a call ending. Silence. Then Damien appeared in the kitchen doorway and looked at Evelyn with the expression of a man who had just had his timeline compressed by someone he couldn't argue with. Thursday, Evelyn said. He looked at her steadily. You heard. I wasn't trying to. He came into the kitchen and poured himself coffee from the pot on the counter and stood there for a moment with both hands around the mug, which she realized was the first time she'd seen him hold anything without complete deliberate control of his grip. It was a very small thing. It told her quite a lot. Marco is moving the visit earlier, he said. He'll be here Thursday with his wife and both advisors. They'll stay until Sunday. That's 5 days from now. Yes. We've had 6 dinners together, Evelyn said. I know you take your coffee black. You don't eat red meat except occasionally at formal meals, and you have a scar on your left hand from something you haven't mentioned. That's not enough. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Not offense, but attention of a particular quality. What else do you need? Everything you haven't told me. She set down her tablet. Stories. The kind that come up naturally in conversation. Why you chose this house. What you did before you ran the family. Whether you've been married before? She held his gaze. The things a woman who'd been with you for 6 months would know without asking. The kitchen was quiet. Petra had disappeared at some point in the last several minutes with the impeccable timing of a person who understood when to be elsewhere. Damien set down his coffee mug. He pulled out a chair across from her and sat down, which was not something she'd expected. He was a man who stood when he was in command of a room, and she'd noticed that about him. Sitting felt like a different mode, like a deliberate change in register. Ask, he said. She asked. She asked for 2 hours, and he answered, and some of the answers were complete, and some of them were the shape of an answer with the substance removed, and she cataloged which was which. He'd come to Chicago at 19 with his adopted sister after their family in New York was destroyed. That was the word he used, destroyed, plain and final, and built the Valenti name in Chicago from almost nothing over 15 years. He had not attended university. He had educated himself with a comprehensiveness that made formal education seem like an approximation. He understood finance, law, architecture, 3 languages, and the particular mechanics of power in the spaces where official structures met unofficial ones. He had never been legally married before. He said this plainly, answering her direct question, and it was true. She could feel when he was omitting things, had developed a sense for it over the past 6 dinners, and this was not an omission. He had never been legally married. Whatever story existed about a wife, it was not that. She filed that too. On Thursday morning, Marco Valenti's convoy arrived at 11. Evelyn was standing beside Damien at the top of the stone steps when the cars came through the gates. She was wearing a dark dress, and her hair was down, both choices she'd made deliberately, understanding that she was costuming herself for a performance and that the performance needed to be specific, not overdressed, not trying too hard. The clothes of a woman who'd had time to settle into a life. Damien stood close enough to her that their arms were nearly touching, which was closer than he'd been before, and she registered that calibration. He judged the exact distance that read as genuine without requiring contact. It was, she thought, a very precise calculation. Marco Valenti was shorter than his nephew by several inches and older by what looked like 20 years, though the power he occupied was identical in quality if different in style. Where Damien was contained, Marco was expansive. He came up the steps with the rolling momentum of a man who expected the world to arrange itself around him. His wife, Elena, was elegant and watchful, and smiled with the warmth of a woman who had spent decades being an extremely effective observer of other people. Marco looked at Evelyn. His eyes moved over her with the thorough assessment of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading people and knew exactly what he was doing. Not hostile, not friendly. Professional, in the oldest sense of the word. "So," he said in accented English, looking at Damien. "This is her." "This is Evelyn," Damien said. His hand came to the small of her back the first time he'd touched her, and she held herself from reacting because this was the performance, and she was a professional. "My wife." Marco looked at her for another long moment. Then his face broke into something that was almost a smile. "You have good taste," he said to Damien. "Finally." Elena Valenti took Evelyn's hands in both of hers with a warmth that was either genuine or the best approximation of it she'd ever seen. "We have been so curious," she said softly. "Damien keeps everything so close. You must tell me everything." "I'll tell you what I can," Evelyn said, and smiled, and meant neither. The 3 days that followed were the most technically demanding performance of Evelyn's life, which was saying something, given that her actual life involved telling parents their children were dying and maintaining a functional face throughout. She sat at long dinners and answered questions and laughed at appropriate moments and touched Damien's arm at intervals that she'd calculated felt natural and not performed. And she watched Marco's advisors watching her with their old professional eyes, and she held the story exactly where it needed to be. Damien, beside her, was flawless. That was the word she kept coming back to. Not perfect. Perfect implied effort visible at the surface. Flawless meant the effort was entirely internal. He spoke about her with the casual authority of a man who had been sleeping beside someone long enough to stop thinking about it, and she noticed that he never elaborated without prompting, which was what an honest man does. Honest people don't over-explain. They trust that what's real is visible enough not to need decoration. She was working very hard. She was also, without planning to, paying attention. She was paying attention to the way he moved through his own house when Marco was present versus when he wasn't. The slight increase in stillness and control in the meticulous management of every expressed impulse. She was paying attention to the way he spoke to his uncle with a patience that was technically identical to respect, but was not, she was now certain, respect. It was endurance. He was enduring this man. On Saturday evening, after the formal dinner, Marco requested a nightcap in the library. Evelyn had already excused herself to go upstairs. She was at the second-floor landing when she heard Marco's voice from below, the sound carrying up through the high-ceilinged stairwell in the particular way sound traveled in this house. "She's good," Marco said. "Not a compliment, an assessment. But she's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Damien's voice, level. "Something softer, something more—" A pause. "More chosen for convenience than for character." "Perhaps I'm tired of convenience." A sound that might have been a laugh. "She asks questions. You can see it in her eyes. She's looking for something." "She's a physician. It's her nature." "Make sure," Marco said, "that she doesn't find anything that makes this more complicated than it already is." Evelyn stood very still at the top of the stairs, her hand on the banister, listening to the silence that came after that sentence. "I'll handle my wife," Damien said quietly. "See that you do." She went to her room and sat on the bed and thought about those words for a long time. Make sure she doesn't find anything. Not she won't find anything. She doesn't. Acknowledging that there was something to find. She waited until 1 in the morning when the house was fully quiet and the light under Damien's office door had gone out, and she went to the east wing. The door at the end of the second-floor corridor, the one that separated the main house from the east wing, was not locked. It was simply closed, with a weight to it that suggested it had been closed for a long time. The hinges were silent, recently oiled, which told her someone maintained this space even while keeping it shut. Beyond the door, the corridor was darker, the lighting reduced to low emergency fixtures along the baseboard. The first room was a sitting room, undisturbed, dust covers over the furniture. The second was a bedroom, guest quarters, she thought at first, and then she looked more carefully. The vanity table against the wall had a mirror and the ghost of objects that had once sat on it. Circular marks in the dust where perfume bottles had stood. A smaller oval where something like a jewelry box might have been. The closet door was standing open and it was empty, but the wooden bar where clothes had hung still bore the shallow indentations of hangers used regularly over a long period. Someone had lived in this room. For years. Evelyn moved through it slowly, running her fingers along surfaces, reading the space the way she read a patient's chart, not looking for what was there, but for what was absent and why. The bedside table drawer was empty, but had a pen mark on the bottom of the drawer interior, the kind of mark a person makes when they're writing on a notepad and press too hard. She tilted it toward the low light and made out the impression of numbers. What looked like a phone number or a date, written and torn away but still present in the wood. On the wall beside the window, she'd almost missed it, there was a single mark at the baseboard level. She crouched and looked at it. A small drawing done in pencil, so faint it was nearly invisible. 2 figures, very simple, like a child's drawing, but 2 people standing side by side, one taller than the other. And below them, in the same careful pencil, 2 letters. D and I. Evelyn sat back on her heels and stared at the wall. D and I. Her mind ran it forward and backward. D for Damien. I for someone whose name started with I. Someone who had lived in this room for long enough to carve their presence into the wood and the dust and the empty spaces on the vanity table. Someone whose photographs had been pulled from every wall in the house and whose books had been pulled from the library shelves and whose existence had been systematically erased from every surface except this one small pencil mark that someone had missed or left. She thought about the way Damien had said the word no when she'd asked about siblings. Too even, too controlled. She thought about Mrs. Albrecht's face when Evelyn had said the word home, that first morning at the top of the steps, that flicker, that almost word. She thought about Marco saying she's not what I expected and Damien saying I'm tired of convenience, and the way that particular exchange had felt, in the moment, like 2 people who had a much longer argument running beneath the surface of the one they were having. She sat on the floor of that room for a long time in the dark, surrounded by the preserved absence of a person she didn't know, and felt the shape of the story she'd been missing click into place. Not complete, not yet, but its architecture suddenly visible, the way a building's skeleton becomes visible when the walls are stripped away. Damien Valenti had never had a wife, but he had lost someone. And whatever had happened to that person was the reason Evelyn was in this house, was the reason for the contract and the 1 year and the single condition she must never ask why, Was the engine underneath everything she'd been seeing and not seeing for the past 2 weeks. She was getting up to leave when her foot brushed something under the edge of the bed frame. She looked down. A small flat object, dark, half buried under the dust ruffle that had gone undisturbed for years. She picked it up. A photograph. Small, printed on matte paper, the edges slightly curled from years of humidity and temperature change. She tilted it toward the baseboard light. 2 people. One of them was Damien Valenti, younger than she knew him, 25 maybe. The control less settled in his face, something rawer and less armored visible in the set of his jaw. He was smiling, actually smiling, not the controlled almost smile she'd seen at dinner, but a genuine expression of uncomplicated happiness that she would not have believed his face capable of if she hadn't been looking directly at it. Beside him was a young woman, dark hair, dark eyes. Damien's bone structure, the strong jaw, and the directness of the gaze, but softened and alive with something that the man beside her was only reflecting. She was laughing at something off camera. She looked like someone who laughed easily and often. She looked like someone who had never had reason to stop. On the back of the photograph, in the same careful pencil as the drawing on the wall, 4 words: Isabella and her brother. The air went out of Evelyn's lungs. Not his wife, his sister. And from somewhere below her in the house, from the direction of the main corridor, from the space just outside the door to the east wing, came the sound of a single measured footstep on the hardwood floor, and then silence, and then Damien Valenti's voice, very quiet, through the closed door. "Dr. Harper." His voice came through the door the way cold air comes through a gap in a wall, not loud, not aggressive, just present and unavoidable, and carrying with it the suggestion of a much larger temperature difference on the other side. Evelyn was still on the floor. She had the photograph in her hand, and her pulse was doing something she didn't permit it to do in operating rooms or in conversations with parents whose children were dying, which was running ahead of her control. She looked at the photograph one more time. Isabella and her brother, the laughing woman, the young man with the unguarded face, and she set it carefully on the floor beside her knee, and she stood up. She opened the door. Damien Valenti was standing in the corridor outside the East Wing entrance, and he was not holding anything, and his hands were at his sides, and his face was not what she expected. She'd been prepared for anger, for the cold, controlled version of it she'd seen at the edges of his conversations with Marco. What she found instead was something older and quieter, and in some ways worse. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they have been dreading and have now arrived at and can stop dreading, which is not the same as relief. He looked at the photograph in her hand. She held it out to him. He took it, looked at it for 1 second. No longer. 1 second, exactly. She counted it, and then held it at his side with the careful grip of someone who had to think about how hard they were pressing their fingers together. "You told me not to come here," Evelyn said. "Yes." "You didn't lock the door." A pause. Something moved through his expression that was not quite acknowledgement and not quite anything else she had a name for. "No," he said. "I didn't." They stood in the corridor in the dark for a moment, the low baseboard lights casting shadows upward, which reversed the geometry of his face and made him look both older and more exposed than the dining room version of him she'd been constructing a dossier on for 2 weeks. "Isabella," Evelyn said. His jaw tightened. "Your sister," she said. "Not your wife." "Come out of the East Wing," he said. His voice was very even. "Please." She stepped through the door and he pulled it closed behind her with the careful deliberateness of someone sealing a wound. They stood in the main corridor, and the house was silent around them, the deep silence of 3 a.m. in a large structure where everyone else was asleep. "The story everyone believes," Evelyn said, "is that you had a wife, that she died, that her death is why you're the way you are." She watched his face. "But she was your sister, and she didn't die the way people think." "Stop," he said. I need a moment." He said it flatly, not as a request but as a statement of bare fact, the kind of thing a man says when he is being very honest about what his limits are. He turned away from her and stood with one hand pressed flat against the corridor wall, and breathed, and she watched him do it and did not speak. He was not composed right now. The composure was still there, the way a structure is still there after the interior has been gutted. The exterior lines intact, something essential missing from inside. She understood this was the first time in whatever period of years this house had held this particular silence that someone had walked into that room and come back out with a name. After a moment, he turned around. "How much do you know?" he said. "Only what I just found," she said. "The room, the drawing, the photograph." She paused. "I know she was your sister. I know you loved her. I know that whatever happened to her is the thing this entire arrangement is built around. I don't know the rest." He looked at her for a long time. "Come to the library," he said. They sat in the 2 leather chairs by the cold fireplace, and Damien Valenti told her about Isabella. He told it the way he did most things, without decoration, without the emotional elaboration that would have made it easier to receive, in the flat, precise language of a man reporting facts he had lived with long enough that they had become geological. Isabella had been 2 years younger than him. She had been adopted by the same couple who had taken Damien in at the age of 11 after his parents were killed. A single event, a night in New York, a targeted act that Damien had survived because he'd been somewhere else, and had spent the following years trying to understand why that felt less like luck than like a debt. Isabella had grown up beside him in the years that followed. They'd moved to Chicago at 19 and 18 respectively, when it became clear that staying in New York meant remaining in the orbit of people who had reasons to want Damien specifically to remain small and manageable and grateful. Chicago had been a choice and a project. He'd built the Valenti name into something that couldn't be ignored, and Isabella had been beside him for every step of it, and the only deception they'd maintained between themselves and the world was that she was his wife rather than his sister, because a sister could be used as leverage in ways that a wife legally could not. And he'd been protecting her the only way he knew how to protect anything, which was by making her position structurally unassailable. He stopped talking. The fireplace was cold. The library was cold. The night outside the tall windows was the particular darkness of rural property in November. No ambient light from neighbors or streets, just the flat black of fields and bare trees. "What happened to her?" Evelyn said. He didn't answer immediately. She waited. 3 years ago, he said, there was a man named Gerald Rourke. He ran a pharmaceutical company called Meridian Biosciences. Mid-size, publicly traded, the kind of operation that presents a legitimate front and does most of its actual business underneath it. He paused. Meridian was laundering money through a network of medical research institutions, fraudulent clinical trials, falsified data, funneling capital through academic grants and nonprofit hospital systems. He looked at her directly. St. Augustine Children's Hospital was approached 7 years ago. They were asked to participate. Your father refused. Evelyn's hands were very still on the arms of the chair. Rourke's people destroyed him financially in retaliation, Damien continued. Fabricated debt, regulatory interference, a coordinated campaign to make the hospital appear insolvent to its creditors. The kind of operation that takes years and requires access to banking systems and legal infrastructure that only certain kinds of people have access to. He paused. I found the record of your father's refusal 18 months ago, while I was investigating Meridian for my own reasons. When his debt was transferred to me, I already knew who he was. Evelyn was looking at him with an expression she couldn't feel the shape of from the inside. Your own reasons, she said. Rourke ordered the assassination of my parents, Damien said, 23 years ago. I have spent the last 4 years building enough evidence to prove it. The clock on the library wall ticked. Once. Twice. Isabella, Evelyn said. She found something. She was working with me. She was better with financial records than I was. She'd taught herself forensic accounting. She understood the structures of these transactions better than most people Rourke had on his actual payroll. He stopped. His voice hadn't changed in register, but something behind it had shifted, the way a fault line shifts, invisibly, with enormous consequence. She got too close. They found out she was building a case. 8 months before she... He stopped again, longer this time. Before she died. Rourke's people began surveilling this house. They identified Isabella. And someone told them she was my wife. Evelyn understood. The cold understanding of someone who has followed a chain of logic to its end and doesn't want to be at the end, but is. If she was your wife, Evelyn said slowly, then her death would have been a message to you, not just an elimination of a threat. Yes. But if they knew she was actually your sister, they still would have killed her, but the leverage would have been different. The message would have been different. His hands were flat on his knees. She chose to maintain the story even when she knew they were watching. She chose to be my wife until the end because she understood that a wife's death is a warning and a sister's death is a declaration of war, and she didn't want to give them the war. She wanted me to have time to finish what she'd started. Evelyn sat with that for a long time. Isabella Valenti, who had laughed at something off camera in a photograph, who had drawn two figures on a baseboard in pencil, who had made herself into a target of a specific shape to protect her brother and give him the thing he needed most, which was time. The marriage contract, Evelyn said. The 1 year. You need someone to be your wife while you finish the case. I need Marco to believe the household is stable, Damien said. Marco has his own arrangement with Rourke. Not criminal, not knowing, but financial. He has investments in Meridian subsidiaries. If he knew what I was building, he would feel obligated to warn Rourke, not out of loyalty to me, but out of self-preservation. I needed him satisfied, occupied, not looking too closely at what I was actually doing. He looked at her. I also need someone in this house who has access to medical and research records without raising suspicion. There it was. Evelyn felt the shape of the whole thing settle around her like a room coming into focus. That's why me specifically, she said, not just because I'm credible, because I'm a physician who has access to St. Augustine's archives, because my father was targeted by Rourke, because the records of what your father's company, what Isabella was building the case around, some of those records are in the hospital's own files. In the research archives, your father refused to falsify. Yes, he said. The single syllable landed with a weight that was not, she recognized, an absence of remorse. He was watching her with the careful attention of a man who understood exactly what he'd done, who had calculated the cost of it, the ethics of it, the damage it might do to the particular person sitting across from him, and had made the decision anyway and was not now pretending he hadn't. She said nothing for a long time. You could have told me, she finally said. You would have refused. You don't know that. I know that a woman who has spent her life in medicine and who makes decisions based on complete information would not have walked into an incomplete situation voluntarily. He held her gaze. I needed you in the house before you knew the full parameters. That is not a justification. It is an explanation. It's a manipulation. Yes. She stood up. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him, looking out at the dark garden, and breathed. Her hands were not shaking. She was furious. Not the hot surface kind of fury, but the deep, cold kind. The kind that sits below the diaphragm and changes the quality of every breath you take. She'd signed a contract to save her father. She'd walked into this house in good faith. And the man behind her had engineered every step of it, had chosen her specifically, had structured the debt and the approach and the terms to produce a specific outcome, had used her grief for her father and her love for her father and her fundamental inability to let a thing go unsolved as the instruments of her own recruitment. She turned around. My father, she said. Did you fabricate the debt? No, the debt is real. The original creditors are real. I acquired it legitimately. But you acquired it because of who my father is. A pause. Yes. And the timing, the approach, the contract, all of that was constructed. Yes. She looked at him. I want to be angry at you, she said. You are angry at me. I want to be angry enough to walk out of this house and let you finish this on your own. She held his gaze. But my father's hospital has records in its archives that document what Rourke did. And Rourke destroyed my father's life for 7 years because my father was honest. And if I walk out of here, that documentation goes nowhere, and the man responsible for that and for Isabella and for your parents spends the rest of his life running a pharmaceutical company and attending charity galas. She stopped. So I can't leave. I know, he said quietly. I'm not doing this for you, she said. I know that too. Tell me everything, she said. Every piece of what Isabella found, every record, every financial trail. From the beginning. All of it. She sat back down. No more omissions, no more managed information. If you want me to do this, you tell me all of it, and you tell me now. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she was starting to understand was the closest his face came to unguarded. Not the controlled neutrality and not the composure, but this, the stripped-down quality of a man who had not asked anyone for anything in a very long time and was finding the mechanics of it unfamiliar. "All right," he said. He talked until dawn. She sat and listened and periodically stopped him to ask questions, the same way she sat with complex cases, not passively, actively, pulling at the threads that didn't resolve cleanly. The financial architecture of Meridian Biosciences was labyrinthine, the kind of structure that could only exist because the people who built it understood exactly how legitimate institutional frameworks operated and had designed their deceptions to be invisible within those frameworks. Isabella had spent 2 years mapping it. Her work was stored, partially, on encrypted drives in Damien's office. The rest of it, the documentary foundation, was dispersed across physical records in places that Rourke's people hadn't known to look because they hadn't known what they were looking at, including St. Augustine. Her father had kept records. Of course he had. Robert Harper was a meticulous man, and when Meridian had approached him and he'd refused, he had documented everything. The contact, the proposal, the names of the people who had delivered it, the nature of the financial arrangement they'd described. He'd filed it away in the hospital's administrative archive because he hadn't known what to do with it, and because he was the kind of man who believed that documenting a wrong was the first step toward addressing it. He just never had the mechanism to address it. Until now. By 6 in the morning, they had the outline of a plan. By 6:15, the plan had a problem. Damien's phone rang. He looked at the screen and something changed in his face. Not the micro-shift she'd learned to read, but something larger, a change in the structural quality of his expression, like watching a building's foundation crack. He answered it. He said 3 words in Italian that she didn't understand. Then he listened, and she watched his face, and she understood before he hung up that whatever was coming next was going to change everything again. He set the phone on the library table. "That was one of my people in the city," he said. His voice was flat in the specific way that flatness means the person speaking has taken everything that belongs in their voice and locked it somewhere else because the alternative is losing it entirely. "There was a break-in at St. Augustine last night. The administrative records wing. Someone accessed the physical archive." Evelyn felt the cold move through her chest. "My father's files," she said. "The section your father used for non-digitized administrative correspondence from 2015 to 2018. He looked at her. Everything he documented about Meridian's approach. Gone. The silence in the library was absolute. "How did they know?" Evelyn said. Her voice was very careful. "How did Rourke's people know to look there last night, right now? How did they know?" Damien said nothing for a moment. His jaw was set. "Because someone in this house told them," Evelyn said. He didn't deny it. "Marco's advisors," she said. "They were here all weekend. They saw us working. They saw me. I had my tablet. I had the hospital files open on Thursday. I was reviewing patient records in the kitchen, but the administrative archive icon was on the screen, and anyone standing at the right angle—" "Stop!" Damien stood up. He moved to the window with the contained urgency of a man who is doing the calculations very fast and not finding clean answers. "Marco's advisors report to Marco. Marco's financial interest is in Meridian staying stable. If they saw anything that suggested—" "The files are gone," Evelyn said. "Damien." It was the first time she'd used his name. It came out without the formality she'd been maintaining, and she didn't take it back. "The physical records are gone. Whatever my father documented is gone. That was the documentary foundation of Isabella's case." He turned from the window. "Not all of it," he said. "Isabella's encrypted files still have the financial trail. It's not complete without your father's records, but it's not nothing." He stopped. "But Rourke knows someone is building against him, which means—" His phone rang again. This time the change in his face was instantaneous and absolute. He answered it. He listened for 8 seconds. She counted. He said, "Where?" And then he said, "Don't move him." And then he ended the call and looked at her with an expression that she had never seen on him and hoped she would never see again, because it was the expression of a man from whom something fundamental has just been taken and who is in the process of deciding what he becomes on the other side of that loss. "My father," Evelyn said. Not a question, the cold knowledge already moving through her like water through a broken seal. "He was taken from his house 40 minutes ago," Damien said. "My people have the vehicle's last known position. It went toward the warehouse district along the river. She was already standing." "They took him," Damien said, "because they know what he documented, and they know that even with the physical files gone, a man who was present for those conversations can testify to them." He paused. "And because they know you're in this house." Evelyn looked at him. Robert Harper, who had sat in his armchair with white-knuckled hands and looked at his daughter with the face of a man who had failed to protect the person he loved most. Robert Harper, who had spent 7 years carrying a weight that was never his to carry, who had documented a crime because he believed documentation mattered, who had kept his silence to protect his daughter, and his silence had not protected anyone. "You have people in the city," she said. "Yes." "Can they get to him?" "I don't know yet." His voice was stripped to its bare operational function. "Rourke's people have had 12 hours to prepare. The warehouse district has multiple viable locations and limited access points, and my people are... We are not in a position tonight to run a full extraction without significant risk." "Then we need to move now," Evelyn said, "whatever the risk." "Evelyn, he is 63 years old," she said, "and he has a cardiac history and high blood pressure, and he has been in a car for 40 minutes, going God knows where with people who took him because he's leverage, which means they will keep him alive only as long as he's useful." Her voice did not shake. She had trained it not to shake for exactly this kind of moment, though she had not anticipated that the moment would be personal. "So we move now. What do you need me to do?" Damien Valenti looked at her across the cold library in the gray November dawn, with Isabella's photograph somewhere in the East Wing and 7 years of carefully built architecture crumbling around both of them. And for the first time since she'd walked into her father's living room with 3 black SUVs parked outside, he looked at her not as a variable in a plan or a piece of a performance, but as a person standing in the same wreckage he was standing in. "There's a drive in my office," he said. "Isabella's files. Encrypted. You need to copy everything on it to a secure external drive. There are blanks in the bottom desk drawer, while I make calls." He moved toward the door. "There's also a secondary archive. Isabella kept physical backup copies of her most critical financial records in a safety deposit box at a bank on Michigan Avenue. I have the key. If Rourke's people haven't found that yet, it's the last complete record we have." "Can they have found it?" "I don't know. I don't know how deep their surveillance went during the weekend." He stopped in the doorway. "I have to know how they knew about your father's files. I have to know who in this house told them." Evelyn looked at him. "Ask Marco." His jaw tightened. "Marco will deny it." "Ask him anyway. Let him deny it while you're watching his face." She moved toward the door. "I'll get the drive." She was in the hallway, moving toward the stairs, when she heard Marco Valenti's voice from the direction of the guest wing. The early riser, the man who operated on his own schedule regardless of whose house he was in, moving toward the kitchen for his morning coffee with the rolling momentum of a man who had never once in his life been required to move at anyone else's pace. She stopped. Marco came around the corner and saw her, and he smiled the smile that she'd seen 3 days of, the expansive approval of a man who had assessed her and found her satisfactory. "Early morning," he said pleasantly. Evelyn looked at him. She looked at the ease in his face, the comfort of a man in a familiar space, the particular relaxation of someone who had no immediate concerns. She looked at his hands, at the quality of his posture, at the micro-expressions that moved through his face when he registered her expression and found it was not what he expected. The micro-expressions were all wrong, not confused, not concerned, careful. He was careful in the way a person is careful when they are managing information, when they know something and are monitoring whether you know it too. She had spent a decade reading faces. She had sat across from parents in the worst moments of their lives and read the difference between shock and guilt and grief and preemptive defense. She knew what a person's face looked like when they had been surprised by news, and she knew what it looked like when they had been waiting for the consequences of something they already knew. Marco Valenti had not been surprised to find her in the hallway at 6 in the morning. He had been waiting. "Good morning," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands at her sides were absolutely still. And in her chest, beneath the steadiness and the control and the practiced composure she had built over 34 years of learning how not to break in front of other people, something cold and certain and devastating clicked into place. Marco hadn't just told Rourke's people about the hospital files. He had told them where to find her father. And from somewhere behind her, from the direction of the main staircase, came the sound of Damien's voice on his phone, low and urgent and moving fast toward a situation that had already left the territory of plans and entered the territory of consequences. Consequences that were now moving faster than any of them could run, toward a point where the only choice left was not which path to take, but how much you were willing to lose to keep moving forward at all. Evelyn did not look away from Marco's face. She held his gaze for exactly the length of time a woman would hold it if she had noticed nothing. 2 seconds, a neutral morning acknowledgement, and then she said, "Excuse me," and moved past him toward the stairs, and she climbed them at the pace of someone going to get dressed before breakfast. And the moment she turned the corner into the second-floor corridor, she was moving fast. Damien's office was at the end of the hall. She knocked once and opened the door without waiting. He was at his desk, phone to his ear, his left hand flat on the surface in front of him. He looked up when she came in and read something in her face that made him say into the phone, "Hold," and lower it. "Marco told them," she said, "not his advisors. Marco himself. He already knew about my father when he came around that corner. He was watching me for a reaction." Damien's left hand pressed harder against the desk. The tendons in his wrist went visible. "You're sure?" he said. "I'm sure." He lifted the phone back to his ear. He said, "Marco is the source. Yes, lock the gates. No one leaves." He paused. "All of them." He set the phone down and stood up, and the quality of his movement had changed. The deliberate, unhurried composure was still there, but underneath it something had shifted into gear that ran faster and colder. And Evelyn understood she was seeing the version of Damien Valenti that did not spend his evenings reading financial records and making precise conversation over good food. "The drive," he said. "I need the desk drawer." He stepped aside. She went to the desk, found the bottom drawer, found the blank drives, 4 of them, small, matte black, and then looked at the encrypted drive already connected to his laptop. The screen was locked. "Password," she said. He came to the desk and typed it without hesitation, which told her he'd made a decision somewhere in the last 30 seconds about the level of access he was giving her, and had made it without ceremony. The drive opened. The file structure was Isabella's. She could feel that even without knowing what she was looking at, in the way a particular organizational logic reflects a particular kind of mind, and Isabella's mind had been methodical, hierarchical, built for retrieval under pressure. Every folder labeled, every subfolder dated, the most critical files flagged with a single character prefix. Evelyn copied everything. It took 4 minutes and 40 seconds, and she watched the progress bar with the particular focused patience she used during procedures, where the only thing she could do was hold position and wait. Damien was on a second call, standing at the window, his back to the room. His voice was low and operational, a sequence of instructions in a register that had no room in it for anything other than function. "There's a man named Carver," he said into the phone. "He'll be running the warehouse operation. Ex-military, Rourke's had him on retainer for 6 years. He won't move the target until he has confirmation from Rourke that the exchange is viable." A pause. "That gives us a window, maybe 3 hours. Find the building." The drive finished copying. Evelyn pulled it out and pocketed it. She looked at the window and the gray morning beyond it and thought about her father in a car, in a building, in a cold space that smelled like the river, sitting with his cardiac history and his blood pressure, and the particular terror of a man who had spent 7 years being slowly destroyed and had finally allowed himself to believe it might stop. She thought about that for exactly the amount of time she could afford to think about it, and then she stopped. "What's the exchange?" she said. Damien ended his call and turned. "Rourke wants Isabella's files. He doesn't know the full scope of what she built. He knows there's an encrypted archive and he's known about it for 2 years, but he hasn't been able to locate it. He took your father because he thinks I'll trade the drive for the man." "Will you?" Damien looked at her steadily. "The drive is copied. The original can be surrendered without compromising what we have. But Rourke won't honor an exchange. He'll take the drive and he'll keep your father because your father is a witness and a liability, and eliminating him eliminates testimony." He paused. "I need to get your father out before Rourke knows we've found him." "Then we go now. My people are still locating the building." "How long?" "They're running vehicle tracking on the route from your father's house, cross-referencing with Rourke's known properties in the warehouse district. An hour, maybe less." Evelyn looked at her watch. 6:42 a.m. Her father had been taken at approximately 5:40. He'd been wherever he was for over an hour already. She thought about his face, his hands, the loose gutter on the porch he'd never fixed. "The bank," she said. "Isabella's safety deposit box. Michigan Avenue. We need to get there before Rourke's people do." "I know." If Marco already told them about the hospital files, he may have told them about the box. "I know." "Damien." She waited until he looked at her directly. "If we lose the box, we have the copies, and we have Isabella's encrypted files, but we have no physical records, and no living documentary witness because my father will be gone. We need the box." He was quiet for 2 seconds. "I'll send someone." "Send someone fast." He was already typing. From downstairs, voices. Elena's voice, high, bewildered, the sound of a woman who had come down for breakfast and found the household in a configuration she didn't understand. And beneath it, Marco's voice, still measured, still with that careful quality, talking to someone on his own phone in rapid Italian. Damien moved to the door and opened it and looked down the hall with the particular stillness of a man deciding how to handle a situation that had multiple moving components and limited time for each. "I need to deal with Marco," he said. "I'll get my coat," Evelyn said. She went to her room and put on her coat and her boots, and she stood for one moment in front of her mother's photograph on the dresser. Her mother's face, calm, practical. The face of a woman who had lived her whole life doing difficult things without waiting for someone to acknowledge they were difficult. "I know," Evelyn said to the photograph quietly, and she picked up her bag and she left. Marco was in the entrance hall. He'd positioned himself there with the instinct of a man who understood architecture as power. The entrance hall controlled the exit, and Marco Valenti had spent 50 years understanding which positions in a room gave you the most options. He was standing near the front door with his phone in his hand and his jacket on, and Elena was on the stairs behind him looking frightened in a way that suggested she knew more about her husband's decisions than she'd shown over the weekend. Damien came down the stairs at a pace that was not running but covered ground with the efficiency of something that had decided on a direction. "You need to move away from that door," he said. Marco spread his hands. "Damien, let's be reasonable." "Step away from the door, Marco. You're making this into something it doesn't need to be." Marco's voice was the voice of a man who had been in difficult conversations many times and knew how to use patience as a weapon. "I made a call. I protected an investment. Rourke assured me the situation would be handled cleanly. He took a 63-year-old man out of his house at 5 in the morning." Damien stopped 6 feet from his uncle, and his voice had dropped to a register that was quieter than anything Evelyn had heard from him, which was in its way more frightening than volume. "A man who has nothing to do with this family, who did nothing except refuse to be corrupt. He has everything to do with this." Marco's composure flickered, something genuine coming through, something that was not calculation but the old defensive reasoning of a man who had told himself a story about his own choices and needed the story to hold. "You've been building a case against Rourke for 4 years, Damien. 4 years. Do you know what happens to this family's holdings if Meridian collapses? Do you know how many of our legitimate investments are intertwined? Isabella is dead," Damien said. The entrance hall went absolutely silent. Marco closed his mouth. "Rourke had my sister killed." The words came out with no inflection, which was more devastating than any inflection could have been. "She built the case because she knew what he did to our family. She spent 2 years of her life building the thing that would end him, and he had her killed for it, and you have been protecting him." His jaw was tight enough that the muscles showed at the hinge. "Move away from the door." Marco stepped aside. He looked in that moment like a man who had known something he hadn't let himself know, and was now being required to know it consciously, and the gap between the two knowledges was showing on his face with an ugliness that was human and terrible. Damien walked past him without looking at him again. Evelyn followed. Outside, 2 cars were waiting. Damien's people, 3 men, 2 vehicles, the specific posture of individuals who had been briefed and were running on operational time. Damien spoke to the taller of the 3 men briefly and quietly, and the man nodded and got into the second car with another man, and they left at speed. "Michigan Avenue," Evelyn said. "They'll get the box." Damien opened the door of the first car. "We're going to the river." They had a location by the time they reached the city. One of Damien's people had pulled traffic camera footage and tracked the vehicle to a cluster of decommissioned warehouse buildings on the south side of the riverfront, a section of the city that was perpetually half redeveloped, full of buildings that had been sold and resold and never quite converted, the kind of urban geography that was useful for the purposes of people who needed large enclosed spaces with limited official oversight. Building 4 of the Carver Freight Complex. Camera evidence placed the vehicle entering at 6:03 a.m. and not leaving. They had not left, which meant the exchange call hadn't been made yet. Rourke's man was waiting for instructions, and Rourke was operating on Chicago time and probably hadn't received confirmation from Marco yet that the situation was contained. Evelyn did the math in her head. It was now 7:20. The window Damien had estimated was 3 hours. They had time, barely, if nothing went wrong, if the building layout gave them options, if the 6 men Damien was coordinating with could position properly. She was not military. She was not tactical. She was a physician with a copied drive in her coat pocket and the particular cold clarity that comes from not having the luxury of being afraid. "Tell me what I'm doing," she said. "You stay with the car," Damien said. That's not an answer." He looked at her. "Evelyn, if something goes wrong in there and my father needs immediate medical attention, you need me inside," she said. "Cardiac event. Shock response. Hypoglycemia. He has a history of all 3 when he's under extreme stress. If you pull him out and he's in crisis, your people will lose time they don't have." "I go in." The car was moving fast through the morning city, the streets not yet full, the sky still the flat gray of early November, the river visible between buildings in gray-brown flashes. Damien looked at the road ahead of them. His hands were in his lap, and they were very still, and she watched them and thought about what it had taken to make that quality of stillness habitual. "You stay behind my people," he said. "You don't move until I clear a space, and you do exactly what I tell you when I tell you." "Yes," she said. Not submission, agreement. The specific agreement of 2 people who have the same objective and understand that operational clarity keeps people alive. The Carver Freight Complex was 3 blocks from the river. They came in from the south, pulling into an adjacent lot behind a structure that gave them line of sight to Building 4's secondary entrance. 2 of Damien's people were already there, the advance team, flat against the wall, communicating in the compressed gesture language of men who'd worked together a long time. Evelyn got out of the car and the November cold hit her immediately, the river smell underneath it. That particular Chicago cold that wasn't just temperature but moisture and iron, and the accumulated weather of a Great Lakes city that didn't apologize for its climate. Damien was beside his advance team for 90 seconds, receiving information in fast, quiet exchanges. He came back to her. 2 men on the ground floor. One on the upper level, northeast corner. Your father is in the center room, ground floor. There's a glass partition. They can see him, but it appears he's been left alone. He paused. He's upright, sitting, appears unharmed as of 20 minutes ago when we got visual. The tightness in Evelyn's chest loosened by exactly 1 degree. Carver, Damien said, is in a room adjacent. He's on a call. We believe he's trying to reach Marco for confirmation, and Marco is not answering. A very slight pause at the end of that sentence, the satisfaction of a man for whom one moving piece has, at least, stopped moving in the wrong direction. When we move, Evelyn said, 90 seconds after my 2 people take the upper level and the west entrance simultaneously. There'll be a window of approximately 40 seconds before Carver's two men on the ground floor respond. In those 40 seconds, we get to your father's room. He looked at her directly. 40 seconds. I understand. Are you all right? The question surprised her. Not the words, but the quality of it. Not tactical, not operational, genuinely asking. She looked at him in the cold morning light, this man with Isabella's photograph in his east wing and his parents' death in his chest like a piece of shrapnel that had been there too long to remove, who had manipulated her into a house and a contract and a situation that had put her father in a warehouse and was now asking if she was all right. No, she said. Are you? Something moved in his face. No, he said. Then let's go get him. The operation took 11 minutes from first entry to extraction. It did not feel like 11 minutes. It felt like the compressed eternity of a surgical crisis. The kind where time becomes non-linear, where individual seconds contain their own complete architectures of decision and consequence, where your body moves on instinct and training and something older than both. The two advanced men hit the upper level and the west entrance in unison. Evelyn heard the sounds, not shots, controlled sounds, the sounds of fast physical contact and brief violent resolution. And then Damien said now, and they moved. The ground floor was industrial space, concrete and rusted metal, and the smell of river water and old machinery. Their footsteps were loud despite everything. The lighting was the jaundiced yellow of industrial fluorescents, half of them dead, the remaining ones casting the space in alternating light and deep shadow. 40 seconds. She was running. She was keeping up with Damien and the man beside him, and she was aware of her own breathing, the precise controlled breathing she'd been taught in a medical emergency response course 12 years ago and had never expected to use in a warehouse, in and out, keeping the oxygen moving, keeping the brain functional. The glass partition was ahead. She could see it, a temporary office partition, the frosted kind, with a figure behind it. 30 seconds. Behind them, from the direction of Carver's room, she heard a door open and a shout. 20 seconds. Damien hit the partition door at full momentum and it opened. Her father was there, in a chair, zip-tied at the wrists, not unconscious, awake and white-faced, and for 1 second completely unable to process what he was seeing. Dad, she said. Evelyn. His voice broke apart on her name. She was already at his wrists. She had the small medical scissors from her bag. She carried them always. They were the habit of a decade of work. And she cut the zip ties and took his hands in both of hers and looked at his face, running the fast clinical inventory. Pupils, color, breathing rate, the slight tremor in his hands that could be cold or could be cardiac prodrome. Can you walk? She said. Yes. He got up, unsteady, legs stiff from the chair, but upright. Yes, I can walk. 10 seconds. Damien was at the partition door watching the floor behind them, and one of his men was beside him, and there were sounds from the direction of the west entrance that she categorized as resolved, and sounds from the direction of Carver's room that she categorized as not resolved. Go, Damien said. They moved. Her father was between her and the advance man, being moved more than moving under his own power. And Evelyn had his arm and was feeling every hitch in his gait and measuring it against what she knew about his history and the threshold between functional stress response and cardiac event. They were 12 meters from the exterior door when Carver stepped into the corridor. He was a large man, ex-military, in the way that never entirely leaves the body regardless of how many years pass. The particular construction of someone who had been trained to make themselves into an instrument and had never quite returned from that. He had a gun. He was not pointing it yet. He was assessing. Damien stopped. The corridor was narrow. 12 meters in one direction, the exterior door and the car and the morning light. 7 meters in the other direction, Carver with the gun and the assessment and the operational intelligence of someone who understood the geometry of this moment very precisely. Valenti, Carver said. His voice was flat and professional. Rourke wants the drive. Rourke can't have it. I don't need to debate that with you. Carver's eyes moved to Robert Harper, to Evelyn, back to Damien, calculating weights. I'll let the old man walk. Give me the drive. The drive I give you is a copy, Damien said. The original is in federal hands as of 40 minutes ago. He paused. My people reached the safety deposit box. The complete financial records are already with a contact at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Destroying the copy doesn't undo that. Carver was still. That means you're not an operative completing a mission right now, Damien said, with the quiet precision of a man laying out the facts of a situation to someone who needs to understand them quickly. You're a man with a gun in a warehouse holding evidence of kidnapping and whatever else Rourke asked you to do in the last 72 hours. And the person who told you this operation would stay clean just had the gates of his nephew's estate locked around him while a great many people make a great many phone calls. The math was running on Carver's face. She could see it. The recalculation of a professional who had been contracted under a set of operational parameters and was now discovering that those parameters had changed in ways that altered the risk calculus entirely. The drive is in my pocket, Evelyn said. Both men looked at her. She reached into her coat and produced the external drive. She held it up in the flat industrial light. I'm going to put this on the floor, she said. You can have it. It's a copy. He already told you that. But you can have it, and we walk out, and you decide what you do with the information that this operation is already blown, and your employer is going to need a very good attorney before the week is out. Carver looked at the drive. Evelyn, Damien said very quietly. It's a copy, she said to him, not breaking eye contact with Carver. You said that. I'm just providing proof that we're willing to leave without a fight. She crouched and set the drive on the concrete floor. She stood up. We're walking out. She took her father's arm and she walked. She heard Damien move behind her, heard his footstep, and then his hand was at her back. The same small of the back contact from the top of the estate stairs, but different now. Nothing performed about it, just a hand telling her he was there. And they were moving, and the door was ahead, and she did not look back. Carver did not move. They came through the exterior door into the cold gray morning, and the car was there, and the advance man was already at the wheel, and her father made a sound when the daylight hit him that she would carry for a very long time, the sound of a man who had not been certain he was going to see daylight again. She got him into the car. She sat beside him and took his pulse. Fast, elevated, but rhythmic, no arrhythmia, the tremor in his hands already beginning to subside as the immediate threat receded. His blood pressure was almost certainly high. She needed a cuff, needed to monitor him for the next several hours, needed to get him somewhere warm and stable and safe. Damien got in on the other side and the car moved. Nobody spoke for a full minute. Robert Harper looked at his daughter and then at the man beside the door and then at his daughter again. And she could see him processing the warehouse, the zip ties, the people who had come through a door, the sequence of events that had produced this particular morning. Evelyn, he said, who... Later, she said. Right now I need you to breathe for me. Slowly. In and out. Can you do that? He breathed. She held his wrist and counted. Damien's phone rang. He answered it, listened, said 3 words in Italian, and then sat with the phone in his hand and looked out the window at the city moving past. The box, Evelyn said. Delivered, he said. The FBI contact has the records. Rourke. His legal team has been notified that a federal investigation is active. He'll know within the hour. He paused. He'll run. Can he run? Not far enough. Something in his voice, not satisfaction, not relief, something colder and more final than either. The records Isabella built cover 11 years of transactions across 4 continents. His legal team can stall, but they can't erase what's already in federal hands. He looked at his phone. It's done. She looked at her father, who was breathing steadily now, color returning to his face in increments, the particular resilience of a man who had been carrying fear for 7 years and could feel some of its weight beginning to shift. She thought about Isabella, who had spent 2 years mapping a financial empire and had understood she was in danger and had maintained the fiction of being a wife to protect her brother and had died for it. Who had left the case half-built and trusted that Damien would finish it. He had finished it, with help he had obtained through a method she was still not sure she had forgiven, and might not for a while, and would think about later when there was space to think about things that weren't urgent. The car crossed the river on the Michigan Avenue Bridge, and she looked out at the water, the flat gray November water moving below the bridge, the city rising on both sides in steel and stone. Her father put his hand over hers. She turned to him. His face was older than it had been this morning, in the way faces age in a single day when the day contains enough. But he was looking at her with something she recognized. Not the guilt from her father's living room, not the helpless love from the armchair, something different, something cleaner. "Your mother," he said quietly. "She would have—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I know," Evelyn said. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She looked at Damien, who nodded slightly. She answered it. "Dr. Harper." The voice was male, clipped, official in the specific way of people who worked in institutions that dealt in the currency of evidence and due process. "My name is Agent Delgado. I understand you may have information relevant to an investigation into Meridian Biosciences and its CEO, Gerald Rourke. We'd like to speak with you and the members of your party at your earliest convenience." She looked out the window. The city was waking up around them, morning traffic thickening, the ordinary machinery of Chicago resuming its operations, indifferent to the particular convergence that had been building in its warehouses and libraries and empty East Wing corridors for years. "We're available now," she said. She ended the call and looked at Damien. He was watching her with that expression, the stripped-down one, the unguarded one. The one she'd started to understand was the closest he came to being fully present without the layers of management between himself and the world. "It's not over," he said. It was not a warning. It was an accurate description of where they were, the warehouse resolved, the records delivered, the case in motion. But Rourke still breathing and his lawyers already moving and the institutional machinery of a federal prosecution grinding into gear with the pace and implications of something that would take months and possibly years to fully resolve. "I know," she said. "There will be testimony, depositions. He'll come at the hospital from every legal angle he has left." "I know." "He'll try to discredit your father. He'll try to discredit you." "Damien," she held his gaze. "I know." Outside the window, the river disappeared behind buildings, and the city closed around the car, and Evelyn Harper sat in the middle of it with her father's pulse in her fingertips, and a copied drive already obsolete in her pocket, and the particular feeling of standing at the far edge of something terrible and looking back at all the distance you've crossed and understanding, for the first time, the full shape of where you've been. From the front of the car, the driver's radio crackled once and went silent. Damien's phone lit up with a name she couldn't read from her angle, and he looked at the screen, and something moved through his face that she'd never seen before. Not the composure, not the operational mode, not the stripped-down candor of 3 in the morning in the library. Something that looked, with a quality that surprised her completely, like fear. "What?" she said. He turned the phone so she could see the screen. The name on the incoming call was Rourke, and before either of them could speak, before the car could stop, or the morning could catch its breath, or the weight of the last 12 hours could arrange itself into something manageable, the call connected, not because Damien had answered it, but because someone, somewhere in the network of this morning's chaos, had patched it through. And Gerald Rourke's voice filled the car, smooth and precise and utterly without panic. The voice of a man who had spent 40 years being the most dangerous person in any room he walked into and had no intention of stopping now. "Damien," Rourke said, "I think it's time we spoke directly." Nobody moved in the car. The call sat open on Damien's phone like a wound that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to close or keep bleeding. Rourke's voice had settled into the interior of the vehicle and taken up residence there, smooth and ambient and patient in the way of a man who understood that silence was a tool and was perfectly willing to use it at length. Damien looked at the phone. His jaw was set. His hands were completely still. Evelyn watched his face and saw the specific internal conflict of a man who had spent 4 years building toward a moment and was now being asked to decide, in the space of a stopped breath, what that moment actually meant to him. Whether it was justice or whether it was something older and more personal that had been calling itself justice for long enough that the distinction had blurred. She reached over and picked up the phone. Damien looked at her. She held his gaze for 1 second. not asking permission, not explaining, and then she said, "Mr. Rourke, this is Dr. Evelyn Harper." A pause, shorter than she expected. "Dr. Harper." His voice recalibrated, the same smoothness, the same patience, but now with the specific quality of a man encountering a variable he hadn't modeled. "I wasn't expecting you." "I know," she said. "That's why I answered." Her father was very still beside her. Damien had not moved. "I'm going to tell you what the situation is," Evelyn said, "and I'm going to do it plainly because I think that's faster and more useful for both of us than whatever you'd planned to say to Damien." She kept her voice even, clinical. The voice she used when she needed a room to understand something without the distortion of her own emotion. The financial records Isabella Valenti compiled over 2 years are now in federal hands. The documentation my father maintained from 2015 to 2018 regarding Meridian's approach to St. Augustine Children's Hospital has been submitted as supporting material. Agent Delgado of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division is expecting our testimony within the hour. Your legal team has presumably already told you some version of this, which is why you called. Rourke was quiet. "You called Damien," Evelyn continued, "because you believe that he's the principal, that this has been his operation, his case, his personal vendetta, and that if you can reach him directly, you can find the pressure point that makes a man trade justice for something that matters more to him." She paused. "You miscalculated. This is not Damien's case anymore. It's mine. It belongs to a 63-year-old man who's sitting beside me right now with marks on his wrists from zip ties and 7 years of his life spent under a debt your organization fabricated. It belongs to Isabella Valenti, who understood exactly what she was doing and did it anyway. You cannot buy or threaten or negotiate your way out of what has already been submitted to federal custody." She heard Rourke breathing on the other end. Just breathing. The breathing of a man who was running calculations that were coming up wrong. "There is one thing I'll offer you," she said. "Not a deal. Not a negotiation. Information. The investigation is active and moving regardless of what you do in the next 12 hours. If you run, that becomes evidence of consciousness of guilt, and it will be used as such. If you direct further action against any member of either family, the federal contact receives an additional package of documentation we have held back specifically for that scenario." This was not entirely true. They had held back nothing specifically, but it was true enough, and the line between those two things was one she was willing to stand on. "The most intelligent decision you can make right now is to go home and call your attorney and cooperate with the process that is coming regardless." Another pause. Longer. "You're a pediatrician," Rourke said. "Yes. You're telling me how to conduct myself. I'm telling you what the situation is. You can do what you want with that." The line went quiet for 4 seconds. Then it disconnected. The car moved through the city. Nobody spoke. The driver's eyes were on the road and the morning had gone fully overcast, the flat gray sky pressing down over the skyline. Chicago in November behaving exactly as Chicago in November always did, indifferent and enormous and completely unmoved by what was happening in the cars moving through its streets. Robert Harper let out a long breath that had a shape to it. Not a sigh, not relief, something more structural. Like a wall he'd been holding up for years finally being permitted to come down. Damien was looking at Evelyn. She handed his phone back without looking at him. "He'll run," Damien said. "Maybe," she said, "but he'll run slowly and visibly because he's not a young man, and he's not a man who's had practice at running, and people who run leave trails." She looked out the window. And the FBI doesn't lose people who leave trails. She was not certain of this. She was certain enough. They went to the FBI's Chicago field office, and they spent 4 hours in a conference room with Agent Delgado and 2 of his colleagues and a woman from the Financial Crimes Division, who had the particular focused energy of someone who had been working toward exactly this kind of morning for a very long time. They gave testimony. Robert Harper described in the careful, deliberate language of a man who had spent years compressing this story into the smallest possible space and was now being asked to expand it back to its full size, every detail of Meridian's approach in 2015 and every subsequent action taken against the hospital and against his finances. He described it without drama and without self-pity and with the specific credibility of a man who had documented everything as it happened, because he'd understood even then that documentation was the only form of protection available to him. Damien provided the framework of Isabella's case, the financial architecture, the shell companies, the networks of fraudulent research institutions, the movement of capital across jurisdictions. He spoke with the compact precision of someone who had rehearsed this testimony internally for years, not knowing when he would be able to deliver it, and the delivery was clean and complete, and the two agents leaning forward across the table were not leaning back. Evelyn testified about the hospital records, about the archive, about what had been taken and what had been preserved. She was precise. She was calm. She was the most composed person in the room, which cost her more than anyone watching her would have known. They were released at 12:30 with instructions not to leave the city and a business card each. Gerald Rourke was placed under federal investigation by 2 o'clock that afternoon. His passport was flagged at the airport at 3:15, which confirmed that Evelyn had been right about him running, and Damien had been right about the running being slow and visible. His attorney released a statement at 5 o'clock that contained the words "cooperating fully with authorities" and was not believed by anyone who read it. Marco Valenti's connection to Meridian's subsidiary investments triggered a separate but related inquiry. He was not arrested. He was questioned. The questioning lasted 9 hours and left him visibly diminished in the way that questions about decisions you've spent years not examining tend to diminish a person. Elena flew home to New York that evening. Marco followed the next day in a car that Evelyn, watching from an upstairs window, thought looked slightly too small for everything he was carrying inside it. She did not feel satisfaction at that. She felt something more complicated and less clean than satisfaction. The particular weight of consequences landing on people who deserved them, landing on people who were also, in the end, only human. Robert Harper spent 2 days in a hospital room on Evelyn's insistence. His blood pressure had been dangerously elevated, and his cardiac markers were elevated enough to warrant monitoring. He lay in the hospital bed in the institution he'd built, and nurses he'd hired 20 years ago came in and out with the quiet efficiency of people who loved their employer in the specific way that good people love someone who has built something worth caring about. And he received their kindness with the particular difficulty of a man who had been carrying shame so long that being cared for felt unearned. Evelyn sat with him on the second evening. The room was quiet, the hospital sounds outside the door familiar to her in the way of a language she'd spoken so long she didn't hear it as language anymore. "I should have told you," he said. "Years ago." "Yes," she said. He looked at her. He'd expected something softer, maybe. She'd decided he didn't need soft. He needed accurate. "You should have told me," she said. "And you didn't, and I understand why you didn't, and understanding why you didn't doesn't change the fact that you shouldn't have done it." She looked at her hands. "We're going to be okay. Both of us. The hospital is going to be okay. But we're going to have to talk about the years between, at some point, and actually talk about them, not manage around them." "I know," he said quietly. "Not today," she said. "No." He looked at the ceiling. "Not today." She stayed until he fell asleep, and then she sat for a little longer in the chair beside his bed, in the hospital where she'd worked for 6 years, listening to the building breathe. She drove back to the estate alone. One of Damien's people had brought her car 2 days ago, and she'd been using it, and the familiarity of driving her own vehicle through the familiar route had the strange quality of normality in the middle of abnormal, the kind of cognitive dissonance she recognized from the early days of her residency, when terrible things happened, and then you ate a sandwich because your body required it. The gates opened when she arrived. She hadn't called ahead. The house was quiet. The weekend's guests were long gone. Marco's people had cleared out their belongings, and the household had resettled into its ordinary rhythms with the adaptive efficiency of a structure that had weathered disruption before. Mrs. Albrecht met her in the entrance hall with the particular combination of relief and dignity of a woman for whom those two things had long coexisted. "Mr. Valenti is in the library," she said. "Thank you, Mrs. Albrecht." She paused. "How is your father?" "He's going to be all right," Evelyn said. "He's stubborn." Something shifted in Mrs. Albrecht's expression, a warmth that was genuine and had been held at careful distance for weeks. "Good," she said simply. "That's good." Evelyn went to the library. Damien was in one of the leather chairs by the fireplace. There was a fire tonight, the first she'd seen actually burning in that grate, and the room was warm and smelled of wood smoke and old paper and the particular quality of space that has been inhabited by careful thought for a long time. He had a glass of whiskey, half full, and a folder on the table beside the chair. He looked up when she came in. She sat in the other chair. They were quiet for a moment. The fire made the only sound, the small domestic sounds of burning wood, and outside the windows the November dark was complete. Rourke's attorney filed preliminary cooperation paperwork this evening, Damien said. The federal case is proceeding. Full investigation, not a negotiated exit. How long? The attorneys say 18 months to trial, minimum. The financial crimes are international. Jurisdiction questions alone will take, he stopped, a long time. And during that time, we testify as needed. We cooperate. We don't interfere with the process. He looked at the fire. Isabella's work will be credited in the federal filing. Her name will be in the record. He paused on that. Let it sit. She'll be in the record. Evelyn watched his face. The firelight was doing something different to it than the candlelight had done over dinner, or the lamp in her father's living room, or the industrial fluorescence in the warehouse corridor. It was making him look like a person rather than a performance of a person. She thought she understood now that there wasn't that much difference between the two, that the composure and the control and the management were not a mask over something more real, but were the structure through which something real had learned to survive. She would have been 38 next month, he said. Evelyn said nothing. She liked the library, he said. She was the one who organized the books. The system you noticed, the categorization, the left side placement, that was hers. A pause. I kept the gaps because I couldn't decide what to put in them. Something that wasn't her books felt wrong. Empty spaces felt wrong in a different way. He looked at the gaps on the shelves, which were visible even in the firelight. I think I'll leave them. You should, Evelyn said. He looked at her. They're honest, she said. Empty spaces where something was. That's honest. He held her gaze for a moment and then looked back at the fire. The year ends in 3 weeks, he said. The contract. She'd known it was coming. She'd been tracking it the same way she tracked anything with a defined endpoint, not with dread, but with the background awareness of a person who plans around time. I know, she said. I had the paperwork prepared last week, he said. The dissolution documents, clean, everything agreed upon. I know. Mrs. Albrecht mentioned it. Something moved in his face. Did she? She mentioned it the way someone mentions something when they're hoping you'll have something to say about it. Evelyn looked at the fire. She's very fond of you, in her way. She was fond of Isabella. She's fond of you too. They're not the same thing. She paused. Mrs. Albrecht is a woman who decides what she thinks and then waits to be proven right. She's been deciding something about me for 3 weeks. What has she decided? Evelyn looked at him. You'd have to ask her. The fire settled, a log shifting, a small collapse of burning wood that sent a brief flare of light across the room, and then subsided. The things I did to bring you here, Damien said. He was looking at the fire. His voice had the quality of a man choosing words carefully, not for effect, but because the accuracy of the words mattered to him. The debt, the contract, the information I withheld. He paused. I've thought about how to... I don't have a framework for... He stopped, started again. I'm not good at this. No, she agreed. I'm going to try anyway. He looked at her. I chose you because you were the right person for what I needed. And I chose you before I had any basis for knowing you were the right person for anything beyond that. And those two things have become difficult to separate. He paused. I'm not asking you to forgive the method. I'm telling you that the person I found inside the method is someone I did not expect and cannot now imagine this house without. Evelyn looked at him for a long time. This man who had lost his parents at 11 and built a name from nothing at 19 and protected his sister in the only way available to him and failed to protect her anyway, and had been carrying that for 3 years with a stillness that would have looked from the outside like moving on. This man who did not over-explain and did not perform, and had sat across a dinner table from her 37 times in 1 year, and argued with her exactly twice, and listened to her intently every single time she spoke, and had stood with his hand flat against a corridor wall at 3 in the morning because she'd said a name and the name had broken through the composure in a way that nothing else had. She had not expected any of this. She had walked into a contract with her eyes open and her heart deliberately withheld, and had somehow, in the specific chemistry of proximity and shared stakes and the accumulation of 100 small, honest moments, run out of reasons to keep withholding it. "I'm not ready to forgive the method," she said. "I know. I'm going to need more time on that. I understand. But I'm also—" She stopped, looked at the fire, looked back at him. "I'm not going anywhere because a piece of paper says I can. I'll go when I decide to go, and I'll stay when I decide to stay. And right now I'm deciding to stay. And that has nothing to do with my father's debt or a courthouse or any document you had prepared last week." Damien looked at her with the stripped-down expression, the unguarded one, and she saw in it something she'd seen in the photograph in the East Wing, the younger man, the one without the full armor of the intervening years, the one who'd been caught in a moment of uncomplicated happiness. It wasn't the same face. It was older, and the happiness was not uncomplicated and probably never would be again. But it was in the same family of expression, and it was real. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay," she said. They sat with the fire for a while. The weeks that followed had their own particular quality. Not the compressed urgency of the crisis weeks, but not the careful managed distance of the early contract weeks either. Something different. Something that was being built in real time without a blueprint, with the incremental progress and occasional structural uncertainty of anything built without one. Evelyn continued her shifts at the hospital. Her patients, who had no idea what their physician had been doing in November, continued to be sick and frightened and resilient in the way that children are resilient, which never stopped moving her no matter how many years she accumulated. She ate lunch in the hospital cafeteria and argued with the pharmacy about drug delivery schedules, and sat with parents in the same conference rooms where she'd always sat with them. And the work was the same work, and it held the same weight, and she was grateful for that. Robert Harper was discharged after 4 days. He returned to his house and began the process of working with the federal investigators, which required him to sit with attorneys and revisit in careful legal detail every year of the thing he'd been carrying. He did it with a thoroughness that surprised no one who knew him, and a stoicism that was partly his character, and partly, Evelyn suspected, the particular relief of a man who was finally allowed to set something down. He came to the estate for dinner in December. He'd met Damien twice before, under circumstances that did not particularly lend themselves to measured assessment, and the third meeting had a different quality. They sat at the long dining table, the three of them, with good food and decent wine, and the specific awkwardness of people navigating a relationship that had been forged in extremity and was now being asked to function in ordinary circumstances. Robert looked at Damien for most of dinner with the careful attention of a man taking a measure. "You used my daughter," he said finally, over the dessert he wasn't eating. Damien met his eyes. "Yes?" "To get to Rourke." "Yes." "And everything else?" Robert paused. "The contract. The way you set it up. The debt." "Yes." Robert was quiet for a moment. He looked at Evelyn. She returned his look without any particular expression. She was not going to navigate this for him, and he understood that, and the understanding was a kind of progress between them. "Did you know," Robert said to Damien, "when you set it up, what kind of person she was?" Damien considered this. "I knew the facts of her. I didn't know her." "There's a difference." "A very large one." He paused. "I knew the facts because I'd done research. I didn't know her until she walked into your living room and her first action was to check on you." He looked at the table. "That was not something I'd calculated." Robert was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his wine glass, and then at the man across the table, and then at his daughter, and something moved through his face that was the complicated arithmetic of a father who understands he does not have the standing to object, and loves his daughter enough to accept that understanding gracefully. "You build things," he said to Damien. "That's what you do. You build structures, plans. You're very good at it." He paused. Don't do that with her. She deserves better than being a structure. I know that, Damien said. Do you? I'm learning it, Damien said. That's the accurate answer. Robert looked at him for another moment. Then he picked up his wine glass and drank from it and set it down and said, The roast was excellent. What do you do with the garlic? Mrs. Albrecht from the kitchen doorway permitted herself a very small smile. The trial date was set for the following autumn. Rourke's cooperation had turned partial within a month of the initial filing. His attorneys had found leverage points and blunted several avenues of prosecution, and the case was going to be long and contested and would require all of them to return to those conference rooms and those depositions and those careful architectural renderings of the past. Evelyn knew this. She'd accepted it. She'd accepted it the way she accepted a long treatment plan for a complex patient, not with enthusiasm, but with the specific practicality of someone who understood that some recoveries were not quick and the length of them did not diminish their necessity. In January, she asked Mrs. Albrecht to have the East Wing opened. Not emptied. Not renovated. Opened. She did this because she had noticed, over 2 months of living in the main house, that the closed East Wing generated a particular quality of absence that spread through the adjacent corridors the way cold spreads from an exterior wall. It wasn't, she'd decided, serving anyone. It wasn't preserving Isabella. It was just holding a shape of loss without allowing the loss to breathe. She mentioned this to Damien on a Tuesday evening in the library, carefully and directly, the way she mentioned things she thought mattered. He was quiet for a long time. Not changed, she said. Not taken apart. Just not sealed. The window in that room faces east. The morning light is good there. It seems wrong that the room doesn't get it. He looked at her. Isabella drew those figures on the baseboard, Evelyn said, because she wanted to leave a mark that was hers. She wasn't trying to disappear. She was trying to be remembered. She paused. A sealed room isn't memory. It's just silence. He said nothing for a long time. The fire burned. All right, he said. The East Wing was open that week. The dust covers came off the furniture. The windows were cracked to let the accumulated stillness of 3 years out and the winter air in. The vanity table was dusted but not cleared. The circular ghost marks left exactly as they were, because Evelyn had been specific about that. The closet remained empty, but the door was left open. The pencil drawing on the baseboard, the 2 figures with their letters, was left exactly as Isabella had made it. Damien walked through the room the first morning it was open. Evelyn waited in the corridor. She heard him in there, not sounds, just the weight of a presence in a space. And she waited, and after several minutes he came out and stood in the corridor with her and looked at the wall above the door where one of the removed photographs had once hung. He didn't say anything, she didn't either. They stood there together for a moment in the ordinary morning light of a January day. And then she went to get her coat for work, and he went to his office, and the house continued its existence around them. In March, the hospital's independent board was formally constituted. The restructuring plan, which Evelyn and her father had worked on with the hospital's administrative team through the winter, was approved by the city's healthcare authority. St. Augustine Children's Hospital would operate under independent nonprofit governance, free from the financial entanglements that had made it vulnerable. The debt was formally extinguished. Robert Harper's name appeared in the founding documents of the reconstituted board as the institution's original physician-founder. The press release was low-key and accurate and said nothing about Meridian or debts or warehouses or any of the machinery that had been required to reach this particular morning. Evelyn read it on her phone in the parking lot of the hospital and sat with it for a while. She called her father. I saw it, he said when he picked up. His voice was full of something she didn't have a clean word for. The specific texture of a feeling that has been compressed for years being allowed its full volume for the first time. It's good, she said. It's right, he said. There was a difference, and he knew it, and she knew it, and the difference was everything. The divorce papers were still in Damien's desk drawer. Neither of them had discussed them since December. They were not, she thought, going to be used, but the conversation about that belonged to a Tuesday evening in the library, and a fire and time they hadn't yet had, and they would have it, and it would be honest, and what came after it would be whatever it was. She was not afraid of that. She drove back to the estate through the late winter city, bare trees and early light, and the first tentative suggestions of something softening at the edges of the season. The drive was familiar now, in all its details. The turn by the gas station, the stretch of road where the trees thickened, the private road through the bare-branched old growth, the gates that opened before she reached them because someone inside was tracking her arrival. She pulled up to the house and got out of the car and stood for a moment on the stone steps looking up at it. It was still formidable. Still limestone and dark wood, 3 stories, symmetrical. Still the kind of structure that implied the importance of what it contained. But it did not look now the way it had looked that first November morning when she'd stood here and looked up at it and felt the weight of an irreversible decision sitting in her chest. It looked like somewhere she'd been for long enough that its specific textures were mapped in her body. The way the second step had a slightly different sound to it than the others. The quality of light through the library windows at 4 in the afternoon. The smell of the kitchen in the morning. The sound of Mrs. Albrecht's footsteps in the corridor, which had a particular rhythm Evelyn had learned to distinguish from every other sound in the building. She went inside. Damien was in the entrance hall, in. He wasn't coming to meet her. He was simply there, holding a folder, in transit between one task and another, and he looked up when she came in with the particular quality of attention she had come to understand was specifically for her. Not the cataloging assessment of the first nights, not the tactical attention of the crisis weeks, but the attention a person pays to someone whose presence changes the atmosphere of a room for them. The board approval went through, she said. I saw, he said. How is he? Good. She unwound her scarf. He sounded like himself. She thought about it. More than he has in a while. Damien nodded. He looked at her with the stripped-down expression, the one she trusted now. Dinner's at 7, he said. I know, she said. She hung her coat and she went upstairs, and through the window on the landing she could see the dormant garden beginning its slow, visible work of deciding to come back, and the gray March sky above it with its own tentative negotiations with a season that hadn't arrived yet but was coming, and she stood there for a moment watching it. She thought about the year that had passed, not with regret and not with uncomplicated gratitude, but with the complex, specific weight of everything that had actually happened. The night with 3 black SUVs on a quiet street, the contract signed with a steady hand, the house that held its breath, the East Wing and the pencil drawing and the photograph, the warehouse and the cold and her father's wrists, the fire in the library and the honest gaps on the shelves where Isabella's books had been. She thought about what it cost and what it made and what the distance between those 2 things looked like from here. She thought about all of it for exactly as long as she had standing at a window, and then she went down the hall to her room without qualification, and she changed her clothes and washed her face and looked at herself in the mirror with the habitual clinical assessment she'd been applying to herself her whole adult life. She looked tired. She looked like someone who had come through something and was still in the process of understanding what she'd come through. She looked like someone who had made a decision she couldn't have predicted on the night a year ago when she'd sat in the dark on the edge of her apartment bed and understood she was going to be afraid and decided to go anyway. She looked, she thought, like someone who had ended up somewhere real. She turned off the bathroom light and went to set the table for dinner, in the house that had stopped waiting for her to leave.